Hey folks, it's awesome to be here. As someone who was born and brought up here in Bangalore, and or as they call it, a Bengaluru Huduga, it's awesome to be back in town talking about things that I've been working on, cybersecurity. So today we'll be talking about something that's a hot topic, top of mind for everyone across the board, agentic AI. But before we get started, a little bit about me. Who is this guy who's coming in talking about agentic AI? A little bit about what I do and my background as such. So I'm the co-founder of Oreo. We are a little young company, about 4 months old, focused on building the security platform for agentic AI. We are funded by a few amazing folks at Village Global, Seven Hills, the former CISO of Twitter, and Golden Sparrow, who's based actually locally here. Um, Before founding Oreo, I was part of Wiz. I was part of the go-to-market team, part of the product marketing team, and grew the business there from about 50 to about 750 million when I left earlier this year. Prior to that was at Okta, the identity company, and I've been in cybersecurity for longer years than I can remember, about 15 years. So with that said, today when we speak to CISOs, executives across the board, agentic AI is top of mind. I heard earlier in the day, there's speculation if this is in production or not. Where is agentic AI from an adoption perspective? Seems like everyone's on a spectrum. There are people who are already in production. These are the early trailblazers. There are folks who are like thinking about it, experimenting, playing around with it. From our own research and survey, we found that 85% of companies are in some form of adoption of agentic AI, which is pretty impressive. And when we think about which teams are thinking about agentic AI, which teams, which stakeholders are involved in the conversation, we see that, hey, over 4 to 5 different teams across companies, across security, across engineering, across legal, and as well functional teams that want to adopt agents are very excited about the prospect of agentic AI. So broadly speaking, a lot of stakeholders involved in the agentic conversation. But it goes without saying, with any sort of adoption curve like this, and especially of new technology like this, there's a whole range of new sort of risks that emerge, but existing risks don't go away. So we think that, hey, this agentic wave that is breaking out there is not just a new way to work. It is going to define how we think about work, how we engage at work, the tools we use to get things done. But it's also going to append folks we care about, the security team. A lot of how they operate, a lot of how they think, a lot of the way they approach security and risks, it's going to change quite a bit. You're going to be seeing right now, Sarup, show me the proof. Why is this different? Like, why is this so different, right? What we see is that when we look at agentic AI, there are a few fundamental surface areas that change that really begs the question that, hey, this is foundationally something very new, very different that you need to think about. Now, you could start from the input layer, right on top, right? You're moving from a world of forms to a world of like prompts. Great. There's a whole bunch of risks as to like what input is being fed into those prompts. But also things like the identity layer, what sort of identity, how do you track which agent is operating and on behalf of which user, as well as the authorization layer are foundationally going to be appended from an agentic perspective. But also beyond that, the tooling or the middleware, right, which was largely API based, is now being added along with, with all these new technologies like MCPs that come into play. So ultimately, the key point I want you folks to think about is that as you think about agentic AI and you think about risks involved with agentic AI, the surface area that is involved is foundationally different, it's foundationally changing, which really begs the question as to why a lot of executives are very worried or very cautiously optimistic about the prospects here. So this is the point that I think we should like all do. I open up my laptop, do a pitch or show a demo or like show my sales deck. But I think we're a pretty young company. We're still in fairly stealth in how we operate. So maybe we should do what we should do. And I thought is a good use of time for everyone is like basically share everything we've learned. We've been talking to a lot of security executives across the global landscape, but primarily in the Fortune 5,000, 2,500 range, across the 3 major operating environments, right? The US, Europe, as well as the India region. And we've been doing both surveys and interviews to understand what do they really worry about from an agentic perspective? What are their core concerns, right? A lot of this insight is from like fairly like senior level folks at these companies, and we found a few recurring themes as we had these conversations. So what we're going to do is going to talk about what are those patterns that keep every CISO awake at night as they think about agentic deployment inside of their enterprise. So really want to start this conversation about the problem with visibility. When we did the survey, when we did the interviews with CISOs, this was the biggest surprising fact we learned, right? Like the question is the statement we often hear in various forms is we're adopting agents. My developers are adopting agents. Our SaaS products have agents. We have agents embedded inside of like the browser or the endpoint. I have no idea what my attack surface looks like, or I have a visibility gap from an agentic standpoint. Not only are they concerned about the tools being deployed, they're also worried about like, hey, the unapproved middleware that might be part of this agentic journey, right? This could be things like, MCPs that haven't gone through a security process or tools that have been exposed to public agents. They're very worried about all of these key concepts. The other piece that really stood out is that, hey, uh, the lack of security controls or the lack of standardized security controls here really brings into question about like what sort of like risk are they exposed to. So the lack of visibility for us was one of the key surprises that we did when we did the survey and we spoke to people in a lot of depth, that I need something to understand what's going on in my environment from prompt all the way up to tool execution and completion of task. I need that end-to-end visibility in front of me. The second piece, which shouldn't surprise anyone, but it does, is it feels like authentication and authorization from an agentic standpoint hasn't been well defined from a practitioner, from a security practice perspective. Now, if anyone's following MCP and the conversation around OAuth, you'll know the circus. There's been a lot of discussions here, a lot of new RFCs, a lot of new specifications being written pretty frequently and updated. But ultimately, there are a few key gaps from an authorization, from an identity services perspective, right? There's an ambiguous principal problem, right? Now, let me give you an example that is pretty common. If an agent operates on behalf of a user, how do I know what the agent is doing? How do I trace that back to an individual user who executed the task? The primary principle that you need to track is pretty unclear. Other common issues we see is that, hey, you have an issue of long-standing privileges, or like overprivileged agents operating in the environment, which kind of is very surprising because a lot of CISOs that we spoke to have spent a lot of time investing on zero trust principles and getting to least privilege access. And ultimately, what we see is that, hey, authentication is one of those strategic control points from an agentic perspective. And today, it's not really solving any key problem from an enterprise point of view. The third pattern that I'm sure this room is really familiar with, or at least has been a very hot topic from a thought process perspective, has been the whole conversation around MCP. Now, there's a lot of acronyms that say the S in MCP stands for security, and some people say mostly critical security issues. There are a lot of funny names to describe MCP. But MCP is provided, for those of you who are not very familiar, a very convenient way to convert natural language requests presented in prompts to system level access through APIs, so on and so forth. While this convenience seems very natural and very architecturally apt um, from an implementation standpoint, it's brought some broad risks and concerns here. Now, the first set of risks we hear about is like the whole MCP supply chain itself. Today, as we see, everyone is building out an MCP and deploying it, but who's done the AppSec part of that, of making sure that that MCP itself doesn't have any security risks? I'll tell you a fun story that happened, I think, a week ago for me. I was talking to one of the largest, let's say, fitness and healthcare companies out there, and I got to the conversation getting to thinking that we'll start talking about visibility. The CISO said, "Hey, before we go further, I want to show you something," and he showed me let's call it a flagship security vendor, their MCP that he had downloaded to like basically query event information, and he had run Sneak on it, and he showed two criticals and one high on the MCP instance that was running locally on his machine. It sounds like it sounds um, a little alarmist, but the reality here is that the MCP layer itself, the infrastructure itself, needs a layer of like cleansing before it's deployed in your environment. But beyond that, if you've done all the work to make sure that you've picked the right package, done all the homework from an AppSec standpoint to make sure the right sort of code bits are being hosted or run in your environment, there are a whole range of security issues that require controls in the middleware, whether it's risk of tool poisoning, whether it's the risk of like compromised MCP tools, or on the other side, whether it's the MCP runtime itself. You need to make sure that there's a lot of that all the risk patterns here are taken care of. Now, there's a lot of work going on in terms of both the both in terms of the authentication part around MCP, but also as well as the security controls around MCP. And we think there'll be a lot of progress, a lot of great companies and businesses to be built around here. But today, when you think about your developer who enthusiastically went and downloaded an MCP package and installed it and is running in their environment, the risks are real. And having the right sort of controls here to make sure that the right sort of processes are implemented are actually very foundational. So the other piece here, which is something that I hesitated adding into this presentation going in, was the whole conversation around the prompt. Now, prompt the idea of securing the prompt has existed since RAG applications took off. Like since about a year and a half, we've seen a lot of companies come up on the space of like, hey, building prompt security products. There are also some phenomenally good open source tools like Nemo guardrails and others that you can drive a lot of security controls and practices from a prompt standpoint. But we've consistently heard that, hey, CISOs want some sort of control from a prompt standpoint. We want to make sure that the prompt itself has been, there's a level of control here to make sure that, hey, when users enter a prompt, whether it's from a data loss perspective, whether it's from a data exposure perspective, tool manipulation perspective, the right sort of tooling is implemented or the right sort of security controls are in place. Now, to outside of the big four, your authentication authorization, your visibility gaps, your MCP middleware and prompt, there are four allied topics that are frequently mentioned as part of the security conversation with agents. No, now one way I like to think about it is above the model and below the model. And one thing that comes up that's below the model is the whole conversation around model poisoning and training data and making sure the right sort of controls are part of that conversation. But equally important is the whole conversation around observability, making sure you know exactly what happened, but also you have the right sort of data security controls, whether it's the DSPM side of the house or the DLP side of the house. Having the right sort of controls has been something that most companies, most security practices are thinking about implementing or like building it out as they think about agents being deployed in the enterprise. So these are the common patterns we have seen from what keeps CISOs and security teams awake at night, right? There's none of it is perfect, but it seems like there's a lot of like issues here from like what the security community can come together and really build and solve for. So we also like as part of the surveys and conversations we had, some of them were very generous in their thinking and their and sharing that they did share some of the patterns of like how they think about what is the ideal security stack for agents in the enterprise, what are the right sort of controls to think about. So we kind of put together this like quick CISO survival guide for agentic AI and what people think about in terms of like, hey, what's the security architecture, what sort of controls should I be thinking of, as well as what should I do in the 30 60 90-day period. So from an agentic standpoint, what we've seen is that companies that have a sense of advanced maturity here, uh, fairly forward-thinking organizations from a security standpoint, the generalized pattern we see from a control, from a technology stack perspective, as well as a security control perspective is, it really starts with visibility, right? Start with visibility And when I say visibility here, I want to take some time to explain what this really means. Visibility is what we see is knowing which agent, where are they running? Is it on the endpoint? Is it in the browser? Is it as part of a SaaS app? Is it something that I'm custom building as part of my overall, as part of, let's say, Amazon Bedrock agent or something like that? Getting visibility of like where the agent lives, understanding what middleware it's part of. This is tools, MCP middleware that it connects to, understanding what identity is used to connect to those tools, as well as understanding what data sources are part of that conversation is something, when you say visibility, that's what they particularly mean. Now, beyond that, there's also horizontal visibility where there's a function of like what are the models, that the agent is using, how is the agent planning, any sort of like observability data that you can get from the agent itself as part of the visibility conversation. The way a CISO put this out to me is that I need something to understand who entered what data, which machine, which prompt, which MCP did that connect to, which agent identity did it use, which identity is it using to connect to the backend, as well as which tools did it have access to, as well as which data points did it have access to. That's the level of that's the sort of product that makes them feel like very confident about what's going on, because frankly speaking, no CISO out there wants to block agents from being deployed, right? They want to be part of that conversation. They want to be part of that promotion of these modern tools in the enterprise. That's the part of visibility. The second piece that's part of this journey is the prompt security piece, right? I mentioned this earlier when I spoke about prompt security, but the focus here is having the right sort of controls at the prompt layer, whether it's DLP-like controls, policy-like controls, making sure that, or even like what I call as like light PAM and IGA governance kind of capabilities to monitor and record what date questions are being asked, as well as like what data is being returned, is part of that prompt conversation. The third piece of the stack is the MCP and auth gateway. So going back to that example that I told you, or the story I told you about, the vulnerable MCP, security MCP that the CISO was using, the underlying request here is that, hey, if MCPs are the way in which agents talk to data sources or call tools or invoke tools or run tools, the gateway becomes a critical control point to make sure that the right sort of actions are happening. So here they asked from the idea of the MCP auth gateway, and the auth gateway here is to like, hey, make sure the right sort of access is provided, whether it's an OAuth, the type of authentication flow, whether it's an OAuth flow or an on behalf of flow or a PXE flow. There's hundreds of different ways agents can actually talk to the backend, but having the right sort of like control layer is critical here. But also preventing things like credential sprawls, making sure agents themselves authenticate to the MCP server, and then making sure that the MCP servers then have the right sort of like tokens to make those backend calls. That's the ask around the MCP auth layer. Now, I touched upon observability before, but observability is becoming a very critical part, whether it's from a compliance conversation, but also or from the perspective of like, hey, I need to know what did the agent do, how did it plan, how did it come up with that decision that it did to run those tools or access data sources. Two other pieces here that I've heard different companies mention is the data security conversation, the DSPM product. They say like, hey, we need DSPM capability to make sure that we have done the homework upfront to classify our data, label our data, run the right sort of access policies around that. That's a critical part about the whole agentic stack. And increasingly, an area we're seeing CISOs talk about is the whole idea about red teaming your agents, doing some sort of adversarial testing, making sure that you have the right sort of audits and controls, as well as making sure that the overall agentic lifecycle itself is tracked and monitored and measured. So this is what we have seen as the most common repeatable pattern from an agentic security stack standpoint. So if you're someone here who's worried about agents, whose developers are like saying, hey, I want to try this agent, or you're like being pretty cautious, right? I have some suggestions from what I've seen work as a 30, 60, 90-day plan as to like what are the right approaches to like thinking about agentic and what should you be doing, right? So the first step is focus on really stabilization and just understanding what's going on across the board. And that really starts with like building up an inventory through either a dedicated product or a set of products and getting a complete inventory of all your agents, all your tools, all the MCPs, all the identities involved, and having observability turned on, right? You can't defend what you don't see. Starting with that is really foundational for this. But also, as you do that initial work, it's very important to get cross functional alignment, whether it's different stakeholders across security, legal, IT, individual functional teams that want to deploy their favorite dev agent or the marketing agent or the sales agent, having those individual stakeholders bought in, as well as the security KPIs defined, is really what the first 30 days was for a lot of our folks we spoke to. The next piece is really focusing on the 60-day plan, which is really focusing on control and contain. Think about your most important security controls that you could have in place. One of this that I highly recommend is auth. Think about how you think about your authorization strategy. Particularly fine-grained authorization might be something that's very relevant here, as well as your overall access policy. Some customers spoke about moving from a traditional role-based access model for agents to a more task-oriented view called task-based access management. And try to think about how you think about, try to really focus on the strategy behind uh, how the access model is defined. But it's also a great way to like clean up your middleware, making sure that the MCPs have the right sort of scans done, the right sort of, there are no risks inside of your middleware itself. The last piece in this is really on the 60-day plan is to focus on the prompts, making sure you have the right sort of prompt controls, the right sort of auditing, the right sort of policies defined. One one executive in one of the large health HR fintechs told me that they, you know, they tried out. They're actually one of the early pioneers on an agentic standpoint, and they built out bots and deployed inside of their enterprise. And they found that pretty soon people could query fairly sensitive information, right? So one of the quick ways they went about fixing that was actually having a set of policy controls in the prompt, but also a set of authorization, like a lot more fine-grained, narrow-scoped authorization, so that sensitive data repositories were not accessed, right? So this is some of the things that people are doing on a 60-day plan. Moving further, when you think about the 90-day plan, right? The 90-day plan is really focused on really appending the processes, really up-leveling how you think about MCPs are built and deployed, and and making sure that the process to build and deploy MCPs as well as agents have a level of, let's say, high assurance around how they get deployed. So apart from that, couple of CISOs particularly spoke to me about, like, they get a lot of board pressure about deploying agents, building agents, and like everyone sees the upside of agents. Building out the right sort of metrics that you can report both from a security perspective, but also from your IT side, which is pretty involved and invested in deploying agents, is a good way to think about the 90-day plan. So my recommendation is, if you are someone who's worried about agents, start with visibility, stabilize the environment, build out and deploy controls, and finally think about how you report, how your processes can be further refined and operationalized inside of your environment. So with that, we've come to the end of my quick, short talk, hopefully. So my recommendation, if you are in some part of this agentic journey, is know your attack surface, understand where agents are built, deployed, in the middleware that's part of it. Think about how your foundational controls are built, whether it's data or whether it's access management. Think about that. The last two pieces here is really focus on observability. It saves your day. Trust me about this. I've known a lot of people who've like been able to correlate what went on because of the fact that they had the right level of observability turned on, and take a more proactive approach to security here, whether it's at the prompt, whether it's at the MCP level, or the host or the API level. This will like pay long-term dividends across the board. So with that, we've pretty much come to the end of my talk. But we have a booth outside. I've seen a ton of you out there and had great conversations. Love to chat, hear your opinions, hear your feedback. Come back and say hi. We have a little early formed LinkedIn page. If you want to like connect with us on LinkedIn, we'll be sharing more as the company gets built out. And if you want today's content or some other fantastic content that I thought would be useful for anyone thinking about agents in the enterprise, uh, do put your corporate ID. We do have Gmail and consumer ID, consumer emails blocked, but do try to access this link. I have OWASP wrote out an awesome much more technical threat model. Just published it out 2 days ago. Some of members of our team were part of this journey. So take a look at it. It's really phenomenal. Also, this deck is there as well as some other assets that I thought there's a checklist, there's an MCP security checklist that I've relied on quite a bit. Go ahead, take a look at it. I'm sure it'll help you as you think about your own agentic security journey. With that, the conversation doesn't end. Stop back if you see me around, say hi. I promise you I don't bite. Love any sort of conversation, feedback, or thoughts or opinions. With that, thank you.